The night was heavy, filled with silence that carried more fear than any scream could. The moon hid behind broken clouds, and the streets were nothing but ruins of a world that once had life. Broken glass crunched under weak footsteps, and the air smelled of smoke and dust. Humanity was no longer a proud race walking under bright lights. They were survivors, crawling through shadows, afraid of every sound. He remembered it all. He still remembered that night when the world changed. The night when the sky burned red, and people thought it was the end. No one knew what happened first. Some said it was war. Others whispered it was nature taking revenge. But deep inside, everyone felt it was something greater, something beyond their understanding. Cities fell silent. Technology, power, comfort, everything was lost in a matter of hours. Now, the world was nothing but cracked roads and empty houses with doors swinging in the wind. The sound of a door hitting the wall again and again was like a cool reminder. This place was once alive. Children used to laugh here. People used to dream here. But now, silence owned it all. In the middle of this silence, humanity tried to breathe. They hid in underground tunnels, broken basements, or inside old subway stations. Firelight replaced electricity, and the sound of coughing and crying filled the air instead of music and laughter. But even in this emptiness, there was something nobody wanted to speak about. They all felt it. Shadows that didn't belong to humans. Whispers in the dark that had no mouth. A feeling of being watched when no one was there. That night, he was only one man among many, sitting with a small group of survivors in a cold, damp basement. The candlelight shook as if afraid to burn. The walls dripped with water, and rats moved in corners, making scratching sound that made everyone freeze. He looked at the faces around him. Old men, women holding children, young boys trying to look brave. Their eyes were wide and empty, carrying the same question. Will we see tomorrow? No one dared to speak. Words were dangerous. Words made noise, and noise invited attention. And in that world, attention was death. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. A distant echo, like metal falling against stone. Everyone froze. Heart stopped for a second. The children pressed their faces into their mother's arms. He held his breath, listening. The sound came again. Clang, clang, slow, steady, too heavy for a rat, too strange for the wind. Someone whispered, "They are here." But no one asked who they were. Everyone already knew. He wanted to believe it was only his imagination, but he had seen things before. In the last city he crossed, shadows had moved against the light. He saw a figure tall as two men, standing in the middle of the road, watching. When he blinked, it was gone. But he still felt its eyes burning into his skin. Now, in the basement, with the candle flame trembling, he felt it again. A presence. Something standing just outside the door, silent, waiting. His heart pounded so hard it felt louder than the falling metal sound. He prayed it would not hear. He prayed everyone would stay silent. The children shook in their mother's arms, but no one made a sound. The fear was stronger than any cry. Fear was the only thing keeping them alive. Minutes passed like hours. The sound stopped. The silence returned. But it was not peace. It was the silence of something listening, something searching. He could not sleep that night. His eyes stayed open, staring at the shadows on the wall. Every shape looked like a monster. Every drip of water sounded like a footstep. He felt as if the world itself was watching him, waiting for him to close his eyes so it could take him away. And in that silence, a memory burned inside him. The memory of the old world, the world with light, with laughter, with simple human warmth. He wondered if it was gone forever, or if there was still a way to fight. Because deep down, he knew one thing. If humanity gave up, if they accepted extinction, then the shadows would win. And so, with fear in his heart and hope as small as a flickering candle, he whispered to himself, "We must not end like this." He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But in that cold basement, with whispers outside the door, the fight for humanity's survival began. This was not just survival. This was the beginning of the endless fight. The basement was silent again, but silence did not bring peace. Silence was now a weapon. Silence was now survival. He sat with the others, staring at the candle flame that burned weakly in the corner. Its light made the shadows dance across the walls, stretching and bending like dark creatures trying to escape. Every flicker of the flame felt like a warning. The night was not safe. The air was heavy with dust. It carried the smell of damp earth and old smoke, the kind of smell that clung to the skin and made every breath feel dainty. In the distance, deep above the ground, something moved. It was faint, like a sigh, like a whisper. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone heard it. The children pressed their faces against their mother's arms, too afraid to cry. The men clenched their fists, though their hands shook. The women looked toward the door as if expecting it to open at any second. The man felt it again, that strange presence. It was not just fear. Fear was human. This was different. This was like a shadow leaning over his shoulder, invisible but heavy. He could feel it pressing on his chest, making his heart pound faster. He still remembered that day when he first saw them. It was in the ruins of an old city, just after the skies had turned red. He had walked down a broken street, looking for food, when he noticed something strange. The sunlight was weak that day, but enough to cast shadows of fallen buildings and shattered cars. Yet, among those shadows, he saw one that did not belong. It was tall, thin, and it moved when everything else was still. At first, he thought it was a trick of his eyes, maybe smoke or dust. But then the shadow stretched across the wall and turned toward him. No eyes, no face, just darkness moving with purpose. He had run that day, his feet slamming against the broken road, his lungs burning, his ears filled with the echo of his own panic. When he looked back, the shadow was gone, but the feeling of being watched never left him. Now, sitting in the basement with survivors, he knew they were close again. He could almost hear them breathing in the silence. A sudden sound made everyone jump. It was soft at first, like footsteps dragging against stone. Then came another sound, a faint tapping, slow and steady. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the walls, making the candle flame shiver. The old man sitting near the corner muttered under his breath, "They are searching." No one asked what he meant. Everyone already knew. The man looked at the door. It was old wood, cracked and weak. He imagined the shadows sliding under it, filling the room like water. He felt sweat drip down his face though the room was cold. A woman held her child tighter. The boy's small hand trembled as he covered his mouth, trying not to make a sound. Even a single breath felt dangerous. The tapping grew louder. This time, it was not outside. It was closer. It was above. Something was walking on the floor above their heads. Slow, careful, listening. The ceiling creaked. Dust fell. The survivors looked up, their faces pale. The man clenched his fists. His mind screamed, "Don't move. Don't breathe. Don't exist." The sound stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing, not even the sound of rats. Only silence so deep it made his ears ring. Then, without warning, a whisper broke through. It was not a human voice. It was low, almost like wind, but filled with something unnatural. It moved through the cracks in the ceiling, crawling into the room like smoke. The whisper had no words, but everyone understood its meaning. It was hunger. It was searching. One of the children whimpered. Just a small sound, but in that silence, it was like thunder. The man's heart froze. Above them, the footsteps returned. Faster this time. Stronger, as if something had found its prey. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The basement had only one door, and beyond that door was more darkness. He looked at the others. Their faces were pale with terror, their eyes wide, their bodies frozen. No one could move. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The footsteps faded away. The whisper died. Silence returned. But the silence was worse than the sound. Because now, they all knew the truth. The shadows were not blind. The shadows were not far. They were here, and they were waiting. The man closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm inside his chest. When he opened them, he saw the candle flame flicker again, smaller this time, as if it too was afraid. He whispered to himself, words no one else could hear. "We cannot hide forever. The fight will come." And in the darkness of that night, humanity's fear grew deeper. The shadows were not just watching. They were hunting. The night dragged on like a heavy chain. The survivors sat in silence, afraid that even their own heartbeat might give them away. The candle burned lower, its flame struggling against the damp air. Every shadow on the wall looked alive, and every drip of water from the ceiling sounded like a warning. The man's eyes never closed. Sleep was dangerous now. Dreams were dangerous now. In sleep, you forgot to listen, and forgetting to listen meant death. He watched the others. A mother rocking her child, her lips moving without sound as if praying. An old man clutching a broken piece of wood like a weapon, though his hand shook too much to hold it steady. Two young boys sitting side by side, their faces pale, their eyes filled with a fear that no child should ever know. These were not warriors. These were not soldiers. They were the weak, the broken, the ones who had nowhere left to run. And yet they were all that remained. The man thought of the world before, the strong cities, the armies, the leaders. Where were they now? Gone, burned, fallen. It was not the strong who were left. It was the weak. But the weak had something the strong did not. The weak had no choice but to fight, no choice but to cling to life, even when life was nothing but pain. He still remembered that day, long before the basement, when he saw weakness turn into strength. It was in a ruined village where only a handful of people remained. He had wandered into the broken streets, searching for food, when he heard crying. A young girl, no older than 8, sat beside her mother's body. Her face was dirty, her hands shaking, but her eyes were fire. When the shadows came, tall and silent, he thought the girl would run. She did not. She stood. She picked up a broken piece of glass and raised it with both hands. Her voice cracked as she screamed at the darkness, a sound so small yet so full of defiance. The shadows stopped, just for a moment, as if surprised, as if a weak, fragile child had no right to fight back. But she did. That scream gave him the strength to grab the girl and run. It saved both their lives. He never saw her again, but her fire stayed with him. And now, in the basement, surrounded by those who had nothing left, he remembered her. He realized the weak had their own kind of power. Suddenly, a noise broke through the silence. It was sharp and violent, a crash from outside the basement, as if something heavy had fallen. The survivors jumped. The old man dropped his stick. The children gasped. The man raised his hand, signaling them to stay still. His ears strained, listening. Another sound followed, a dragging noise, something scraping across the floor above them. The mother whispered, "They found us." Her words carried terror, but also something else, resignation. She was ready to give up. "No," the man whispered back. His voice was low but firm. "We are still here. We are still breathing." The dragging sound grew louder, moving closer to the basement door. The candle flame shook as if about to die. The man's heart thundered, but he stood up slowly. His body was weak, his hands empty, but he took a step forward anyway. The others stared at him, their faces pale with shock. "What are you doing?" the old man hissed. He did not answer. He placed himself between the door and the others, his body nothing more than a shield of flesh. He knew he could not win, but maybe he could give them one more chance. The dragging stopped. Silence. The man held his breath. His hands clenched. Sweat ran down his face. Then, bang! The door shook violently. Dust fell from the ceiling. The children screamed. The mother covered their mouths with her trembling hands. Bang! Again! Stronger this time. The wood cracked. The sound echoed in the small room like thunder. The man's legs shook, but he did not move back. He stood tall, his eyes fixed on the door. If this was the end, he would face it standing. The survivors behind him stayed in silence. For the first time, they saw something in his eyes, something they thought had died long ago. Hope. The door shook once more, then stopped. Silence. The man waited, his body trembling. He expected the door to break. He expected the darkness to pour in. But nothing happened. The survivors did not move. Minutes passed. The candle burned lower. The silence grew heavier. Finally, the man stepped back, his chest heaving. The door was cracked, but still closed. Somehow, for reasons none of them could understand, the attack had stopped. The survivors looked at him differently now, not just as another weak body hiding in the dark, but as someone who refused to bow down. And in that moment, a truth burned inside him. Even the weak can stand. Even the weak can fight. The last stand of the weak had begun. The cracked door stood like a scar in the room. The survivors stared at it with wide eyes, expecting it to break open at any second. But nothing came. The silence that followed was worse than the banging itself. It was a silence of something patient, something waiting. The candle had burned down to a stub. Its flame was weak and trembling, as if it wanted to escape the basement. Shadows grew thicker on the walls, pressing close, stretching long fingers toward the survivors. The man's heart still hammered inside his chest. He had stood before the door, ready to give his life, but the attack had stopped. Why? The shadows were strong. They could break doors, crush walls, swallow whole villages. Yet they had left. Oh, perhaps they had not left at all. He still remembered that night, days ago, when he realized the truth about them. He had been walking alone through the ruins of a market. The stalls were empty, covered in ash, the air smelling of smoke and rotten food. The silence had felt heavy, but he thought he was safe. Then he heard it, a whisper, not from a mouth, not from a throat, a whisper that came from the air itself. It slid into his ears, soft and cold. At first, he thought it was a wind, but there was no wind. The air was still. The whisper grew clearer. Not words, not a voice, just a sound that carried meaning, a sound that made his chest tighten and his skin crawl. Hunger, that was what he heard. Hunger without a body. He had spun around, his eyes searching. The market was empty, yet he knew he was not alone. He could feel it, the way one feels eyes on their back. He ran, but the whisper followed, not in his ears this time, but in his mind, as if the air itself had entered him. When he finally escaped, he realized something terrible. The enemy was not always something you could see. The shadows were not just creatures. They were in the air, in the silence, in the places between light and dark. And now, sitting in the basement, he feared the same thing was happening again. The children had fallen asleep, their small faces pale and tired. The mothers held them close, rocking them gently. The old man sat with his back to the wall, his eyes closed, whispering prayers under his breath. But the man could not rest. His skin prickled. His ears rang with a faint sound. Not loud, not clear, just enough to remind him of that day in the market. The whisper, it was back. He looked around the basement. The candle flickered, its light bending unnaturally. The shadows on the walls seemed to lean closer. He held his breath. The whisper was not outside. It was here, in the room. He stood slowly, careful not to make noise. His eyes scanned the corners. Nothing moved, yet the whisper grew stronger. It was not sound anymore. It was feeling. It slid under his skin, into his chest, into his head. The mothers noticed his face and stiffened. "What is it?" one of them asked, her voice shaking. "Sure," he whispered. His eyes stayed locked on the shadows. The whisper pulsed through the room, filling it like invisible smoke. The air grew colder. The survivors began to shiver. The old man opened his eyes. His lips trembled. "It is here," he whispered. The survivors froze. No one breathed. The whisper circled them, invisible but heavy. It pressed on their chests, stealing air from their lungs. A child stirred in sleep, letting out a weak whimper. The whisper grew louder, like it had heard. The man's hand shook. His heart screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to run. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay still. The candle flame stretched high, then shrank small, as if the air itself was being stolen. Darkness crept closer, swallowing the corners of the basement. One of the mothers began to cry silently, tears rolling down her cheeks. She pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making noise. The whisper grew sharper now, twisting like a blade. It had no body, but it was alive. It was the enemy they could not fight, the enemy they could not see. The man stepped forward, placing himself between the survivors and the shadows. He spoke softly, his voice shaking but clear. "We are still here," he said. "We are not finished." For a moment, the whisper stopped. The air went still. The survivors stared at him, their faces pale but filled with something new, something almost like hope. The whisper lingered, circling, waiting. But it did not attack. It did not break the door. Finally, after what felt like hours, the candle flickered back to life. The shadows loosened their grip. The whisper faded into silence. The survivors collapsed in relief, breathing hard. The mothers kissed their children's heads. The old man leaned against the wall, whispering, "It will return. It always returns." The man looked at the cracked door. His fists were still clenched. His body shook, but his eyes were steady. He now understood the truth. The enemy was not only outside. It was inside. It was the darkness itself. And if humanity was to survive, they would have to fight something they could not even see. The survivors did not sleep that night. Even when the whisper faded and the silence returned, no one dared to close their eyes. The candle was almost gone, its small flame fighting against the darkness. Every breath felt borrowed, every heartbeat like a countdown to the next attack. But in that darkness, something began to change. The man sat near the broken door, his back against the wall, his eyes heavy but unyielding. He could still feel the whisper inside his chest, like cold ashes that refused to die. It was proof that the enemy was close, too close. But instead of breaking him, it lit something else inside, a small, stubborn fire. He still remembered that day when fire saved them. It was weeks ago when he traveled with another group of survivors through a dead forest. The trees stood black and lifeless, their branches like broken arms. The ground was soft with ash, and the silence felt endless. Then the shadows came. Not whispers this time, but shapes. Tall, twisted figures moving between the trees. The survivors froze. Their weapons were nothing, broken pipes, sharp stones. The shadows circled them, ready to strike. But one woman, her face pale and eyes sharp with desperation, lit a match. She held it high, the small flame trembling in her shaking hand. The shadows stopped. For a brief moment, they hesitated. The woman dropped the match onto the dry leaves. Fire spread fast, crackling, glowing, roaring into the night. The trees burned, the ground lit up, and the shadows pulled back into the darkness. The survivors ran, saved by that small act of defiance. Since then, he had never forgotten. Even the smallest spark could hold back the night. Now, in the basement, with terrified faces around him, he remembered her courage. He looked at the mothers, the children, the old man, and he knew, if they stayed frozen in fear, they would not last. The shadows would win. But if they found even a little spark of defiance, maybe, just maybe, they could fight back. The candle finally died, leaving the room in complete darkness. The children whimpered softly, clutching their mothers. The old man whispered a prayer, his voice trembling. The man's voice broke the silence. "We cannot wait here forever," he said. His voice was low, but it carried strength. "The shadows will come again. If we only hide, they will take us." The survivors looked at him with fear. No one wanted to move. No one wanted to speak. "We must fight," he continued, "even if we are weak, even if we have nothing. We are still alive, and that means we have a choice." A young boy whispered, "Fight? With what?" The man's eyes moved to the corner of the room. A pile of broken wood, old metal scraps, empty bottles, useless to some, but not to him. "With this," he said, "with anything. Fire, stone, even our own hands. We fight with whatever we can hold." The mothers shook their heads. One whispered, "They are too strong. We are only people. We cannot stop them." The man leaned forward, his voice firm. "I have seen a child stand against them. I have seen fire chase them away. They are not gods. They can be hurt. Maybe not destroyed, but hurt. And that is enough for now." The survivors exchanged glances. Their eyes were still filled with fear, but something new flickered there, something they had not felt in a long time. Hope. The man began to gather the scraps from the corner. He handed the old man a piece of wood. He gave the young boys broken bottles. He placed stones in the mother's hands. "This is not much," he said, "but it is better than nothing. If we stand together, even weak, we are stronger than we think." One of the children asked in a trembling voice, "Will this keep us safe?" The man knelt, looking into the child's frightened eyes. "Nothing is safe anymore," he said gently. "But if we do nothing, we are already lost. If we fight, we still have a chance." The old man gripped the wood tighter. "A chance," he repeated. For the first time in days, the basement was not filled with silence and fear. It was filled with movement. Quiet, careful, but alive. Survivors began preparing, tying scraps into makeshift weapons, stacking bottles near the door, whispering plans to each other. It was not much. It was not enough. But it was something. And sometimes, something was all humanity needed. The man looked at their faces in the faint light from a broken window. They were still afraid, but they were no longer only hiding. They were waiting, ready, holding on to that fragile spark. In the distance, the whisper began again, faint and cold. The shadows were returning. But this time, the survivors were not empty-handed. This time, they had fire in their hearts. The endless fight was only beginning. The night was not silent anymore. The survivors had armed themselves with scraps of wood, broken bottles, and stones. Their weapons were weak, but their hearts carried something new, defiance. For the first time since the world had fallen, they were not only waiting to die, they were preparing to fight. The man stood near the broken door, his hand gripping a sharp piece of metal. His body was tired, his stomach empty, but his eyes burned with determination. He could feel the others behind him, mothers holding bottles like knives, the old man clutching his wooden stick, children sitting close, whispering prayers but refusing to cry. The whispers had returned. They moved through the cracks in the walls, soft and cold, brushing against the skin like invisible hands. The candle was gone, but faint moonlight slipped through the broken window, painting the basement in pale silver. Every shadow looked alive. Every corner breathed with danger. The old man muttered, "They are coming." And then they did. The door shook violently, louder than before. Dust rained from the ceiling. The survivors gasped, but no one ran. Not this time. Bang! The wood cracked. Bang! Splinters flew. The children covered their ears, but the mothers tightened their grip on their weapons. The man raised his metal shard like a sword. His heart pounded, but his voice was steady. "Stand together," he whispered. "No matter what happens, stand together." The door broke open. Darkness poured inside, not like normal darkness, but alive, twisting, crawling. Shadows with no bodies, shapes that bent and stretched unnaturally. The air grew cold, stealing breath from their lungs. The whispers turned into screams, though no mouth spoke them. The survivors froze for a heartbeat, terror clawing at their chests. Then the man roared, "Fight!" The basement exploded with noise, which struck against shadows. Stones flew through the air. Bottles shattered, filling the room with sharp edges. The survivors fought with desperation, swinging wildly, screaming, crying, but refusing to fall silent. The shadows recoiled, not in fear, but in surprise. Humanity was fighting back. The man slashed with his metal shard, the air sparking where it touched the darkness. A mother stabbed forward with a broken bottle, her face fierce with rage. The old man swung his stick again and again, his voice breaking into a hoarse yell. The room was chaos. Shadows wrapped around their arms, their legs, trying to pull them down. Cold burned their skin. Whispers pierced their minds, filling their heads with fear. One of the boys dropped his stone and screamed, but the man grabbed him, pulling him back to his feet. "Do not stop," he shouted. "We are still alive. Fight!" Blood dripped from his hand, but he did not care. His body was weak, but his will was stronger. He struck again and again, refusing to give in. Around him, the others followed. Their faces twisted with fear and pain, but their hearts refused to break. The shadows pressed harder. They filled the room, covering the walls, swallowing the light. It seemed endless, hopeless. The survivors screamed, their weapons breaking in their hands, their bodies falling to the floor. But every time one fell, another rose. The old man, his body shaking, stood again. The mothers, their arms bleeding, lifted their bottles once more. Even the children, their voices trembling, threw stones into the dark. It was not victory. It was not strength. It was survival. The fight dragged on, endless, painful, suffocating. The shadows hissed and twisted, but they could not silence the human cry. And then something happened. The darkness wavered. For the first time, the shadows pulled back. Not much, not far, but enough. The whispers softened, as if uncertain. The man saw it. His chest burned with hope. He raised his voice above the chaos. "They are not gods," he shouted. "They can bleed. They can be broken. Do not stop." His words carried through the basement. The survivors screamed with him, their voices rising like fire. They struck harder, faster, fueled not by strength but by fury. The shadows twisted, their forms flickering, retreating into the corners. The air grew warmer. The whispers faded into silence. And then they were gone. The basement fell quiet. The survivors collapsed onto the floor, their chests heaving, their bodies shaking. Blood stained their hands. Glass cut their skin, but they were still breathing. The man dropped his metal shard, his hands trembling. He looked at the faces around him, tired, pale, broken, but alive. They had not won. The enemy was not destroyed. The fight was not over. But they had proven one thing: humanity was not finished. The old man's voice broke the silence. "We fought, and we are still here." The man nodded, his eyes hard. "This is our endless fight. As long as we breathe, we fight." The survivors sat together in the pale moonlight, their wounds burning, their hearts heavy. But for the first time in a long time, there was something stronger than fear. There was defiance. The basement smelled of smoke, blood, and sweat. The survivors lay on the cold floor, their bodies trembling after the fight. Broken wood and shattered glass were scattered everywhere. The walls were scratched, the door cracked, and the air heavy with silence. But this silence was not the same as before. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of survival. The man sat with his back against the wall, his chest rising and falling in slow, painful breaths. His hands were cut, his arms weak, but his eyes were alive. Around him, the others stirred. Mothers kissed their children's heads, whispering soft words. The old man leaned against the corner, his stick broken, but his lips curved into a faint smile. They had not won the war, but they had won a night. He still remembered that day when everything began, when the skies burned red, when the world fell apart, when hope was nothing but ashes. Back then, everyone believed humanity would end. They thought the darkness would swallow the last of them, leaving only silence behind. But now, sitting among the wounded and the weary, he understood something different. Humanity had not ended. Humanity had fought. And even in weakness, even in hunger, even in despair, they had refused to vanish. The children stirred awake, their small eyes blinking in the pale morning light that seeped through the cracked window. The sun was rising outside, its golden rays breaking through the ruins of the city. For the first time in days, the survivors saw more than shadows. They saw light. The man stood slowly, his body aching, his steps heavy. He walked to the door, pushing it open wider. The world outside was still broken, roads cracked, buildings collapsed, smoke rising in the distance. But the sunlight touched it all, painting the ruins in gold. He breathed deeply, feeling the warmth on his skin. Behind him, the old man whispered, "We are still here." The words echoed in the basement. Simple, fragile, yet powerful. They carried the weight of every battle, every loss, every sacrifice. The man turned back to the survivors. His voice was rough, but steady. "This is who we are. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most powerful, but the ones who refuse to fall. We are the species that refuse extinction." The mothers nodded, tears glistening in their eyes. The children clutched their hands tighter. The old man closed his eyes, his smile faint but proud. Outside, the ruins were still filled with danger. The shadows would return. The whispers would hunt them again. The fight was far from over. But the survivors no longer carried only fear. They carried defiance. They carried memory. They carried each other. The man lifted his face to the rising sun. His body was broken, his future uncertain, but his heart burned with fire. "This is our endless fight," he whispered, "and we will not stop." The survivors stepped into the morning light together. Weak, wounded, but unbroken. Each step they took was heavy with pain, but also filled with meaning. They were not just running anymore. They were walking forward, through the ruins, through the silence, through the darkness that still waited for them. Humanity had fallen many times before, but every time they had risen again. And now, even in the face of an enemy that could not be seen, they would rise once more, because they were not just survivors. They were human, and humans refuse extinction.